Wren Takahashi had learned, over 11 years of running a private investment fund most people had never heard of, that the best meetings were the ones nobody in the room knew were about to change their life. She'd walked into hundreds of them by now, some as the quiet money behind a deal, some as the person deciding whether a founder's whole future got funded or didn't, and she developed, along the way, a particular stillness she brought into every room before anyone realized who she actually was. She hadn't expected to need that stillness for her own parents' pitch meeting. But there she was, on a gray Tuesday morning in March, standing in the private elevator lobby of the Halloran Building in downtown Seattle, 3 floors below the Caldwell Group's offices, waiting the standard 90 seconds she always waited before entering a room her own capital had already decided the outcome of. Her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant, Deshawn, who managed her calendar with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for 6 years and had stopped being surprised by the strange collisions her personal and professional lives sometimes produced. "You sure about this one? Still time to reschedule, if you want to avoid it." "I'm sure," she typed back. Some things you can't keep avoiding forever. The story of how Wren came to be the Caldwell Group's largest limited partner, the money behind the money, as her own fund's internal joke went, started 9 years earlier, in a studio apartment in Fremont that her parents had never once visited, though she'd invited them twice. She'd grown up the middle child in a family that had decided, sometime around her adolescence, that ambition looked a specific way, her older sister May's way, which was law school and a partnership track at a downtown firm, or her younger brother Theo's way, which was medical school and a residency that gave their parents something impressive to mention at dinner parties. Wren's path, an economics degree she'd paid for herself after a scholarship fell through in her sophomore year, followed by 4 unglamorous years at a mid-sized asset management firm doing the kind of analytical work nobody at a family gathering wanted explained to them in detail, had never fit the story her parents told about their children. She wasn't a failure, exactly. She was simply the one whose success was too quiet, too technical, too unglamorous to register as success at all. Her father, Richard Takahashi, had built his own modest consulting practice over 3 decades, corporate strategy work, mostly for mid-market manufacturing companies, respectable but never spectacular, and had spent Wren's entire adult life measuring his children's worth against the specific metric of visible prestige. May's name on a law firm letterhead, Theo's white coat. Wren's title, portfolio analyst, then later fund manager, had never carried the same weight in her father's mind, no matter how many times she tried to explain what the work actually involved. Her mother, Carol, was gentler in delivery, but no less certain in substance. Carol had grown up genuinely poor, the daughter of a single mother who'd cleaned office buildings at night, and had clawed her way into a comfortable middle-class life through sheer, relentless effort, a biography she referenced constantly, usually as a preface to some judgment about how her children should be spending their own effort. Carol's anxiety about status wasn't cruelty so much as a kind of inherited vigilance, a woman who never fully stopped believing that comfort could be taken away at any moment unless you kept proving, visibly and repeatedly, that you deserved it. Wren's quiet, unglamorous financial work, the kind that didn't produce a title anyone recognized at a cocktail party, read to Carol as exactly the kind of insufficient effort she'd spent her whole life terrified of falling into. Wren had tried for years to explain what she actually did. She remembered one particular Thanksgiving, 6 years ago now, sitting at her parents' table trying to describe, in terms simple enough to land, the fund she'd just left her old firm to help launch, a small, specialized vehicle investing in early-stage growth companies, backed initially by 2 institutional partners and a modest amount of her own savings. Her father had listened for about 90 seconds before changing the subject to Theo's residency match. Her mother had asked, not unkindly but entirely missing the point, whether the new job came with benefits, the way you'd ask about a job at a call center. She'd stopped trying to explain after that. It was easier, she'd decided somewhere in her early 30s, to let her parents believe whatever version of her career fit their existing framework, something in finance, vague and unremarkable, than to keep offering up the actual truth and watching it bounce off without landing. The silence wasn't dishonesty exactly. It was self-preservation, The kind you develop after enough years of being underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. What her parents didn't know, what almost nobody outside her professional circle knew, because Wren had built a career and a fund defined specifically by staying out of the spotlight, by being the quiet capital behind other people's visible success, was that the fund she'd helped launch 6 years ago, Meridian Peak Partners, now managed just under $2 billion in committed capital, and that Wren herself, as founding managing partner, held not just professional authority, but a personal, limited partner stake in several of the fund's portfolio companies, the Caldwell Group prominent among them. She'd found Caldwell 4 years earlier, a boutique growth equity advisory firm run by a sharp, disciplined chairman named Arthur Bell, at a point when the firm was talented but undercapitalized, doing excellent work for clients while quietly struggling to raise the kind of committed capital that would let them scale beyond a handful of deals a year. Wren had seen what Arthur was building before most of the market had structured a significant commitment from Meridian Peak into Caldwell's fund, and had spent 4 years since then as the largest single source of capital behind the firm's entire operation, present at every quarterly board meeting, consulted on every major hire, trusted enough by Arthur that he'd once told her, only half joking, that Caldwell existed in its current form because she believed in it before anyone else had. None of that was a story that had ever found its way back to her parents. Wren simply didn't talk to them about work anymore, not in any real detail, and they'd never once thought to ask a follow-up question sharp enough to uncover what she actually did all day. Her sister, May, called her on a Sunday afternoon in late February, 6 weeks before the pitch, with news delivered in the specific breathless tone May used whenever their parents had accomplished something. Mom and Dad landed a meeting with the Caldwell Group, May said, for the new consulting venture. You know, the thing Dad's been trying to get off the ground since he's semi-retired. Wren did know, vaguely. Her father had spent the last 2 years building out a boutique consulting practice focused on manufacturing operations, a smaller, more ambitious version of the work he'd done for 30 years, and had recently brought her mother on as a business development partner, a decision that had briefly reunited their parents around a shared project for the first time in years. Wren had heard about the venture mostly secondhand, through May, since her own parents had never once asked her opinion on it, despite the fact that she probably had more relevant expertise on fundraising and growth stage capital than anyone else in the family. That's Caldwell Group as in the investment firm, yeah. Dad's pitching them for a strategic partnership, some kind of advisory arrangement where Caldwell brings them into due diligence on manufacturing deals. It's a big deal, Wren. Mom's been talking about it non-stop. Wren had gone very still on her end of the call, doing the math the way you do math on a collision you can see coming from a distance, but can't quite stop.
Wren?
You still there?
Yeah, sorry.
That's great for them. You okay? You sound weird. I'm fine, Wren said, and didn't explain further, because explaining would have required a conversation she wasn't ready to have with May yet, a conversation about the fact that Wren was, functionally, the reason Caldwell Group had the capital and stability to be taking meetings like this one at all, and that whatever her parents thought this pitch represented, Wren already knew, with near total certainty, how the meeting was going to end. She debated, for most of the 6 weeks between that phone call and the pitch itself, whether to warn Arthur off entirely, to quietly ask him to decline the meeting, to spare her parents whatever was coming, to keep her 2 separate lives from colliding in a boardroom neither side was prepared for. She drafted the email 3 separate times and deleted it 3 separate times, unable to settle on what she actually wanted the outcome to be. It was her closest friend from business school, Yuki, now running her own smaller fund out of Portland, who finally talked her out of intervening, over dinner at a Capitol Hill restaurant 2 weeks before the meeting. You've spent your entire career building something you're genuinely proud of, Yuki said, twirling her wine glass. And you've spent your entire life hiding it from the 2 people whose approval you apparently still want more than anyone else's, even though you'd never admit that out loud. You want my honest opinion? Not really, but you're going to give it anyway. Let the meeting happen. Not to humiliate them, I know that's not actually what you want, even if some petty part of you thinks it might feel good. Let it happen because you deserve, at some point in your life, to stop managing what your parents are allowed to know about you, so they don't have to feel anything uncomfortable. You've been doing that for 15 years. It's exhausting to watch, honestly, and I can only imagine what it's like to live inside. It's not that simple. This is Dad's business. If I let this happen and it goes badly for him, it's not going to go badly for him professionally. Arthur's not going to torch a real deal to make a point. But something's going to happen in that room, Wren, whether you engineer it or not, because sooner or later your dad was going to walk through a door that led straight back to you. You've built something too big to stay hidden forever. Better it happens on your terms than by accident. Wren had thought about that conversation more than she'd admitted to Yuki in the weeks since, turning it over on her runs along the Burke-Gilman Trail, a habit she'd kept for years, the 6-mile loop she ran most mornings before the market opened, one of the few parts of her life that had nothing to do with anyone's expectations but her own. In the end, she didn't warn Arthur off. She also didn't ask him to make a production of it. She simply told him, 10 days before the meeting, in a brief, businesslike email, that the Takahashi Group pitching him for the manufacturing advisory partnership happened to be run by her own parents, that she had no personal stake in the outcome either direction, and that she trusted him to evaluate the pitch entirely on its merits, the way he'd evaluate any other prospective partner. Arthur, who had worked with Wren for 4 years and understood, better than almost anyone in her professional life, the particular quiet discipline she brought to keeping her personal and professional world separate, had written back a single line. Understood. I won't make it strange. But I'm also not going to pretend you're not walking into the building that day, Wren. You built this place. People are going to know that. The Christmas gathering 3 months earlier, the one May would later describe to Wren, only half joking, as the setup nobody knew was a setup, had actually contained the first small tremor of what was coming, though Wren hadn't recognized it as such at the time. Her mother had spent much of the dinner talking about the new consulting venture, with the particular pride she reserved for projects that fit her existing story about what success looked like. We've been building real relationships, Carol had said, refilling wine for the table. Serious people. This isn't the kind of thing just anyone gets access to. That's wonderful, Mom, Wren had said, and meant it mostly. She did want good things for her parents, even the ones who'd spent years underestimating her. I don't think you understand the level we're talking about, her father had added, not unkindly exactly, but with the particular smugness he wore whenever he believed he was explaining something Wren couldn't grasp. The Caldwell Group. Serious investors. This is a completely different world from what you're used to. Wren had smiled, the same practiced, unbothered smile she'd perfected over years of these conversations, and said nothing. She'd checked her phone under the table, not because she needed to, but because it gave her hands something to do besides betray the specific, complicated amusement building underneath her calm. Don't take it personally, her father had added, catching something in her silence he'd misread as hurt rather than restraint. It's just a different tier of business than what you're doing. I don't take it personally, Dad, Wren had said, and had meant that too, in a way he couldn't have understood. The morning of the pitch, Wren arrived at the Halloran Building 40 minutes before her parents were scheduled to, per the standard protocol she followed for every Caldwell board meeting, reviewing the quarter's portfolio updates with Arthur's chief operating officer in a small conference room down the hall from the main boardroom while her parents, unknowingly, made their way through the lobby 3 floors below. Deshawn texted her at 9:52, "Your parents just checked in downstairs. Security's walking them up now." At 9:58, Wren stood in the elevator lobby outside the Caldwell boardroom, watching through the glass wall as her parents entered ahead of her, her father in the good navy suit he wore for occasions he considered important, her mother in a cream blazer, both of them moving with the particular brisk confidence of people who believed they were about to make the case of their professional lives. Arthur Bell stood to greet them at the head of the long glass table, along with the 4 other partners and 2 associates who'd assembled for the meeting, a full boardroom, more attendance than Wren knew her father had expected given how he described the meeting to May as informal, just a conversation. She gave it 30 seconds. Long enough for her parents to sit, for the small ritual of coffee and pleasantries to begin, for her father to open his laptop and start arranging his materials with the careful precision of a man about to deliver the pitch of his career. Then she opened the door. Every head at the table turned. And then, in a motion that took Wren's father a full 3 seconds to process, every person seated at that table stood. Arthur Bell smiled, the particular warm, genuine smile he reserved for moments he clearly, unabashedly enjoyed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, gesturing toward the doorway where Wren stood, "this is Wren Takahashi, managing partner of Meridian Peak Partners and the largest limited partner behind this firm. This is the woman who funds us." Wren watched her mother's face go through several distinct stages in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, and finally something that looked almost like physical shock, the color draining visibly from her cheeks in a way Wren had never once seen in 35 years of watching her mother's face manage difficult emotions in public. Her father hadn't moved. He was staring at Wren with his laptop still open, his prepared opening slide glowing uselessly on the screen, his mouth slightly parted around a sentence he hadn't yet found. "Wren," Carol said, the single syllable coming out strangled, barely audible. What are you?"
Mom, Dad."
Wren stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind her with the quiet, unhurried composure she'd spent a career developing. "I'm sorry, I probably should have said something before this morning. But I think it's better this way, honestly." Arthur, sensing correctly that the room needed a moment to breathe before the actual business of the meeting could proceed, gestured everyone back into their seats with practiced ease. "Why don't we take 5 minutes?" he said. "Coffee's fresh. Wren, Richard, Carol, take whatever time you need." The 5 minutes stretched into 15, spent in a small side conference room where Wren finally sat across from her parents in a version of the conversation she'd been avoiding for the better part of a decade. "You could have told us," her father said, finally, his voice tighter than she'd ever heard it, a man visibly trying to hold together the pieces of a story he'd told himself for years about which of his children had built a real career. "I tried, Dad. More than once. I remember explaining Meridian Peak to you at Thanksgiving 6 years ago, and you changed the subject to Theo's residency match 90 seconds in. I remember Christmas 3 months ago, when you told me I didn't understand what a different tier of business looked like, sitting 3 feet away from the woman who funds the firm you were about to pitch." She kept her voice level, not cruel, the voice she used in board meetings when she needed a room to stay calm rather than spiral, though her hands, folded in her lap, were gripping each other harder than she'd have liked to admit. "I stopped trying to explain a long time ago because it never landed. It was always easier to let you believe I was doing something smaller." "We didn't know," her mother said, and there was real distress in it, not performance. "How could we have known if you never?" "You could have asked," Wren said, gently, but without backing down. "In 15 years, neither of you asked me a single real question about my work. Not what a fund does, not what I actually managed, not why I left my old firm to start something new. You asked May about her cases. You asked Theo about his rotations. You asked me if my job had benefits." Carol's face crumpled slightly at that, an old memory landing with fresh weight. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I know you didn't mean it cruelly. I think you genuinely didn't know what else to ask. I think, Mom, you've spent your whole life terrified that comfort could disappear if you stopped proving you deserved it, and somewhere in there you decided that ambition only counted if it looked like something you recognized, a title, a degree, a specific kind of visible prestige. What I built didn't look like that to you, so it didn't register as real, even though it was the most real thing I've ever done." Wren paused. "And, Dad, I think you've spent 30 years needing your children's success to reflect back on you in a specific way, and quiet, technical, behind-the-scenes work never gave you that. I understand why. That doesn't mean it didn't cost me something, watching both of you dismiss the actual center of my life for over a decade." Her father was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, a man unused to being on the receiving end of an accounting rather than delivering one. "I still don't fully understand what it is you do," he admitted finally, and there was something almost vulnerable in the admission, a crack in 30 years of certainty. "I don't know if I ever will. But I understand enough to know I got it wrong. Badly wrong, apparently." "You don't have to fully understand it," Wren said. "You just have to stop assuming you already do." The pitch meeting itself, once it resumed, proceeded with a strange, careful professionalism. Arthur ran the conversation exactly as he would have run any other partnership evaluation, asking substantive questions about her father's manufacturing consulting pipeline, pressing on the specifics of the proposed advisory arrangement, giving no special deference and no particular hostility either. Wren sat in on the remainder of the meeting at Arthur's invitation, though she said little, watching her father recover enough composure to make his case with real competence, the actual strength of 30 years of manufacturing expertise showing through despite the extraordinary circumstances of the morning. Caldwell Group agreed, 2 weeks later, to a modest pilot advisory arrangement with her father's practice, not because of Wren's relationship to the firm, which Arthur made a point of confirming directly with her father in a follow-up call, but because the underlying work was genuinely strong. It was, Wren thought when she heard the news, almost exactly the outcome she would have wanted if she'd been able to engineer it herself. Her father's business succeeding on its own merits in a room that now also, unavoidably, understood exactly who she was. The months that followed didn't resolve into anything as clean as a reconciliation scene from a movie. Her father called more often, tentative at first, asking real questions about Meridian Peak that he clearly didn't fully grasp the answers to but seemed determined, in his own stubborn way, to keep asking anyway, a kind of effort Wren recognized as the closest thing to an apology he knew how to offer. Her mother sent a long email a few weeks after the meeting, more vulnerable than anything Wren had received from her in years, admitting, in halting language, that she'd built her entire framework for what success looked like around her own childhood fear of instability, and that she was only now, at 61, starting to understand how much that fear had cost her relationship with her own daughter. May, when Wren finally told her the full story over dinner, had laughed so hard she'd nearly choked on her wine. You let them walk into that room completely blind. That's either the pettiest thing you've ever done or the bravest, and I genuinely cannot decide which. Probably both, Wren admitted. I've had a lot of years to get comfortable with things being both. Theo, when he found out, mostly wanted to know if Wren could get him a meeting with anyone at Caldwell about his student loans, which made Wren laugh for the first time in weeks in a way that felt uncomplicated. Wren kept running the Burke-Gilman loop most mornings, the 6 miles that belonged entirely to her. No audience, no evaluation, just the sound of her own breathing and the water on one side of the trail. She kept her Sunday dinners with Yuki, kept mentoring 2 young analysts at Meridian Peak who reminded her, in different ways, of herself at 25, capable, quiet, easy to overlook if you weren't paying close attention. She started, that spring, teaching a guest seminar at the business school she'd attended, something she'd never had time for before, and found unexpected satisfaction in standing in front of a room of students and explaining, patiently, in real detail, exactly the kind of work she did, the thing she'd never once managed to get her own parents to sit still for. She thought, some evenings, about the particular quality of her mother's face going pale in that boardroom, the moment 15 years of careful management had finally, unavoidably, cracked open. She didn't regret letting the meeting happen the way it happened, not exactly. But she noticed, in the weeks afterward, a certain grief she hadn't expected, not for what had been revealed, but for everything underneath it. The years she'd spent building something extraordinary in near total silence, the version of her parents' pride she might have had all along if she'd found a way to make them listen earlier, or if they'd found a way to ask. She didn't know if her father would ever fully understand what she did for a living, or if her mother's fear of instability would ever loosen enough to let her simply be proud without needing to reconcile Wren's success against some older, harder story about what ambition was supposed to look like. She suspected some of it wouldn't fully resolve, that she'd carry the shape of that boardroom, the whole table rising to its feet, her mother's face going pale, her father's unfinished sentence hanging in the air for a long time, not as a wound exactly, but as a permanent, quiet marker in her life. The day she stopped protecting her family from a truth too big to keep managing and started, finally, letting herself be fully seen, even knowing that being seen didn't guarantee being understood. That felt like something worth sitting with rather than resolving. She let it sit,